Well, let's go ahead and get started. Looks like the last of our folks have joined us. Welcome to the NTG Lunch and Learn session about cybersecurity. This is sponsored by our partner, Fortinet. Appreciate you coming, and I hope you find this both educational and enjoyable. A couple of housekeeping rules first. That is, you can go ahead and feel free to use the chat feature to send us questions during the presentation. And of course, use of emojis is allowed and encouraged. To give you an idea, this webinar has two portions to it. It's an intro to kind of set the stage for what EDR is and why that's important at this time. And then the second part will be our partners will come on and do a live demo showing you how their EDR product handles actual malware and issues real time. Also want to go ahead and remind you to hang until the end of the presentation, and we are offering a free cybersecurity analysis. So I'm Charlie Foltz. I've been working in everything from system security and engineering all the way through executive management for probably the last 30 or 40 years. In IT in the last 10 years, really been focusing on security and operations. So everybody is aware that probably the biggest change that's happened of all the IT trends that we've had in the recent years has been the pandemic, the impact that it's had. It's been a major shift. We've moved people from inside the organization to outside of the organization. And as that's happened, we've seen a significant shift in the attack surface and in the way attacks are done. So you can see here from this information that probably close to 40 or close to 70% of full-time workers are working remotely now. Of that 70%, 78% are at home, 9% in the office. You can see they're everywhere from Starbucks to Dunkin' Donuts. And so with that brings a certain amount of satisfaction of the workforce. And whether employers like it or don't like it, 85% at this point plan to work remotely for the rest of their career if possible. So this is a really major shift in what's going on from the last few years of workforce automation and where they're at. So let's talk about working from home. There's the feeling out there with the employees that 50%, 56% of the jobs out there can be done remotely. And of course, of the entire workforce, 85% really do want to work remotely. In fact, it's become so popular that they're looking at 35% of employees are actually willing to change jobs at this point to be able to work remotely. And I think we've all seen the want work hiring. People are offering some amazing incentives to try and get people to come back to work. So people are feeling freer and have more opportunity to go out and search for a different job. So how do we handle that? What do we do about it? One of the things we need to understand of why that's popular and what the issues are with that is there certain attack vectors that are now operational that weren't operational before. One of them is Internet of Things. As you can see, there are 46 billion devices out there, all the way from light bulbs to light switches to door locks to refrigerators to hot water heaters. All of these things are present in people's homes. The issue with that in the home is, how do you make sure that your employees are doing routine updating for antivirus, patches? Are they patching their Internet of Things? When's the last time, well, let's be frank, think to yourself, when's the last time you updated your router? When's the last time you updated anything in your home for Internet of Things? So what's happening as that topology increases, the frequency and the sophistication of the attacks increase because these hackers are now seeing a lot more doors they can knock on to try and get into your network. So one of the other issues with that is publicly accessible Wi-Fi. Right now there are 542 million public accessible Wi-Fis out there. These are mostly guest Wi-Fis at Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts or a place like that. A significant increase from the 94 million that we had back in 2016 when we didn't have so many workers out there. Some of the issues of that are spoofing these Wi-Fi hotspots. Probably every one of you has a hotspot on your phone. If you're knowledgeable with just a little bit of understanding, you can go out to one of these locations, make your hotspot the same name as the guest Wi-Fi, and people will join your phone instead of their guest Wi-Fi, allowing you free access to their traffic. The big thing is, even if they don't, and even if you're not spoofing, yet again, when's the last time Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks or any other place you go has done routine updating for security issues on any of their Wi-Fi devices? Maybe the ones they use for internal setting up their point of sales, but most likely not for their guests. So we have devices out there that have significant security issues that people are attaching to without any hesitation and without really any understanding of the dangers of that. Well, let's just talk about the user devices, period. From the home Wi-Fi, yet again, when's the last time they did an update? I mean, I have auto update turned on all of my devices, and I check them regularly, but I'm sure I'm probably the rare exception. And there's probably, if you queried your employees, most of them wouldn't know whether they had it turned on automatic or whether they had to do it, or if they had to, how they would even do it. And then when you go to the situation of they're no longer corporate devices, they're user devices that are accessing your network owned by them, when's the last time they did routine updating for antiviruses or security patches? Yet again, the sophistication and frequency of the attacks only increase as these devices that are unsecure increase. So protecting your remote devices, that's the real name of the game for this presentation. So you have, at one point in time, you had a non-remote working environment. Everybody came into the office. They were protected by corporate network security tools and firewalls and monitoring, and we did a pretty good job of that, but it was still very much reactive in the long run. Took time to watch things happen, and the process of being corrupted was already in process by the time we figured out something was an issue. I think you've all probably been through that in one way or another. Now it's even worse because now you're in a network connected, it's unprotected and unmonitored. Your employee or employees are sitting out someplace attached to something you have no connection over. Now, I know some of you say, well, we use VPN. Well, the problem is that it's the time before you get VPN connected that device is vulnerable while attaching to that remote Wi-Fi network. So what do we do about that? Well, one of the good news is that, remote devices, they continue to get more powerful. Everybody gets a new PC every few years. They get more and more powerful. They get more and more capability. And so what we've seen is a shift in the market that moves that protection out to the endpoints and makes it reactive. That allows us to see things as they're happening, not after they've happened. So what we're going to do is I want to introduce a couple of folks from Fortinet, our partner. They're going to talk about their EDR solution and then show you some real-time demos. You're going to hear from Jay Kim. He's got over 10 years experience in cybersecurity, and he's a regional director in the enhanced technologies team at Fortinet. You'll also hear from Justin Bell. He also has 10 years in software and security, and he's the systems engineer, senior systems engineer, sorry about that, Justin, on the enhanced technology team at Fortinet.
Thank you, guys. So if you kind of look at the past few years as the threat landscape, as it has been for some time, has really continued to evolve. Signature-based technologies have really failed to protect their users against new variants of malware, ransomware, and other malicious threats, which have led to missed attacks. And though there have been detection and remediation tools which have shortened that time to discover threats, there's continuous incidents that need to be dealt with, alerts that are firing off constantly, which have led to alert fatigue, manual work that's often tied to remediation, which a lot of teams or SOC teams or security individuals just generally don't have, which lead to more work, and especially with the rise of ransomware in recent years, the emergence of malware and ransomware as a service, attackers have really continued to exploit the endpoint more so than ever. If you kind of look at the market since historically and where antivirus really falls, it really began focusing on prevention, basically using signature-based heuristics or what's called thumbprinting to scan for what were known threats. Then around late 2000s, early 2010s, if you look at the bottom right there, challengers came into the market with what is now called next generation antivirus, which touted machine learning, signature-less technology that leveraged AI instead of traditional signature-based mechanisms to prevent threats that were both known and unknown. Soon thereafter came EDR, or Endpoint Detection and Response, as organizations began to see that threats were dwelling in their organizations for longer periods of time. The focus was on post-execution. So once a threat got into the environment, how quickly can you detect the threat, and then how quickly can you remediate it? Where we are in today's market is really a convergence between the two, between EPP, or next generation antivirus, as well as EDR, or endpoint detection and remediation. Prevention focused next generation AV vendors began adding detection and remediation capabilities, and then EDR vendors simultaneously began to add prevention capabilities. And that's what FortiEDR is doing. It is combining the capabilities of both next generation antivirus and EDR into a single agent that goes up to a single management console. Now, if you look at the right-hand side, in terms of, well, a few bullet points I want to highlight real quick. In terms of space, it takes about 60 megabytes of this space. And the reason why we're able to be so lightweight, arguably one of the lightest out there across both AV and EDR space, is because we don't have to store signatures whatsoever. We're completely dependent on our machine learning and our behavioral analysis engine, and nothing more. It goes up to about 120 megabytes per RAM, less than 1% CPU utilization. In terms of operating system support, we support Windows, Linux, and Mac, Windows going as far back as XP, and then 2003 R2 on the server side. Linux 3 flavors today, and Red Hat, Ubuntu, and CentOS. And for Mac, as long as you are above 10.10, which is Yosemite and up, you are fully supported. And when you do deploy, we can support both cloud and on-prem. We are intuitively designed to detect threats locally. So whether you're online or offline, we can fully support both forms of deployment. In terms of the technology, it's really a holistic approach we take. So it's prevention, detection, remediation built into that single agent that I mentioned earlier. Prevention is our next generation antivirus engine. So it's really geared towards on focusing against file-based attacks. So what we're doing is, like I mentioned earlier, rather than scanning the entire disk or system, we're inspecting the files that are accessing this, the files that are being copied over. So let's say, for instance, there's a file that drops into my endpoint. What we do immediately is we utilize our AI and machine learning engine and then examine that file across hundreds of thousands of unique characteristics to determine whether or not that file is malicious or not. If that file is good, great, nothing happens. If that file is malicious, we get a little pop-up on the bottom right saying threat prevented, and then you move on with your day. If the attack is more aggressive, like an embedded macro on a Word document, a PDF document, an Excel sheet, coming from a phishing campaign, or it's like a ransomware attack, for instance, we actually hedge ourselves here, and then we let our detection engine come into play. Now, the core of what we do for our detection engine is how we're installed upon the endpoint. So upon install, what we actually do is we hook ourselves into the kernel. So this allows us to monitor all low-level activity on the endpoint from the operating system, the kernel, the memory, the disk, the registry, the network. And what we essentially do is build a complete context of normal application behavior and look for any anomalies that may exist that are negatively affecting the operating system. So let's say, a ransomware launches, whether you want to try email tag, a ransomware launches. What is that ransomware trying to do to the operating system? Is it trying to access critical system information? Is it a brute force attempt? Is it a pivot stack, kernel injection? Essentially, we're observing dozens and dozens of these behaviors that we know the operating system will observe when malware, red pack, or ransomware gets executed. And once that we see that a rule has been broken to the OS, more specifically a process, that's where we make a judgment call and come in to kill the threat. Now, from a remediation standpoint, when you look at the forensics, we're going to showcase full forensics of events that were recorded. We'll visually tie to an attack graph. We'll let you know where the attack originated, what were the parent processes that occurred afterwards, such as lateral movement, other devices that were hit, files that were manipulated, external IPs that try to reach out to them, etc. So we feed you context behind, what occurred behind the scenes. We do also have a threat hunting tool built in, so if you want to get, even more further granular, that is something you can do. Now, our approach when it comes to automation and just in general is that we take a much more block-first mentality versus some of our competitors in the EDR space. And the reason why we do that is to lessen the noise. And then for the noise that remains, we automate it in the back end. So with FortiEDR, we have a tool called Playbooks, which Justin will showcase here shortly in the demo. And to put it simply, what it'll allow you to do is set up automated policies where you can dictate on what you want to get notified on. So let's say, for instance, adware, right? Adware is not blatantly malicious. What you can do is set up a policy to automatically remediate it and auto-classify it as resolved. Everything's logged in the console. You won't be notified of it. The engine's taking care of it on the back end, right? So that is what helps with the automation portion. Now, when it comes to visibility, application vulnerability assessment, or communication control, we take a snapshot of all apps that are trying to communicate out from the environment. So we'll let you know the applications that are being run. We'll let you know the software vendor, think Google Chrome, Zoom, Firefox, what versions are they running, are any of those versions vulnerable or out of date, all from the management console. So if somebody's running a version of Firefox or Chrome that's 5, 6, 7 versions behind, we're going to let you know all the CVEs that are tied to that specific version. Last piece right here, IoT discovery. Our collector will also showcase what IoT devices are connected. So in addition to the Windows, Linux, and Mac devices that we do support, we give you an additional layer of visibility into your BYOD or IoT devices. So we'll pick up on things like iPhones, printers, smart TVs, Amazon Fire Sticks, for instance, and we'll actually try to categorize them for you. So if it's a Samsung TV, we'll try to find it and categorize it as a Samsung TV, and etc. So these two tools, from a visibility standpoint, will let you, proactively mitigate any sort of risks before they occur, and then give you that additional layer of visibility. Ultimately, to provide a quick summary on this slide, what we're doing is sitting quietly behind the scenes. We're watching the files that are running through disk with our prevention engine. We're watching the application before they execute with our detection engine. If we detect anything questionable, we look at the context, come in and block the attack. If you need further analysis, you can take it to the forensics and the threat hunting tool. Then automation is provided via the playbooks. And then from a visibility standpoint, you have the IoT discovery as well as the application communication control tool. So in terms of benefits, right, real-time protection, this is kind of what I covered, both post and pre-infection protection. So pre is what we're doing with our next generation antivirus engine. Post is that detection capability for anything that's a specifically malicious behavior. Cost automation is a huge portion of our approach. As I mentioned earlier, it's much more block-first mentality. We have customers who have 40,000, 50,000 endpoints that are deployed, being managed by a single IT professional, and it's because of our approach to automation and the way we see that a lot of organizations out there simply do not have the staff to meet their needs of just managing. Ease of use management. Having one single management console that's able to do things that require multiple licensing on some EDR products, that eliminates alert clutter. We automate that portion, like I mentioned earlier, and that makes it very easy to use. Flexibility and scale. Being able to scale to a large environment without having to spin up another instance. A single instance will support up to 120,000 endpoints. Whether they're online or offline, they will be fully supported. We have customers that are in fully air-gapped environments, as well as customers that have a mixture of both. And being able to have that flexibility is huge, as well as compliance, right? Being able to meet the PCI and HIPAA and GDPR needs of our customers. Having said that, I will stop right there.
In terms of what I want to cover here, I'm going to be covering the web console that you see on my screen. I also have a VM running in the background because I'm going to run some samples live for you. In terms of what we're going to go over, we're going to go over security policies and playbooks so I can give you a fundamental understanding of how we do what we do. And then we'll get into the event viewer and I'll run about 3 samples for you, just show you the different ways that we protect. And then I'll pass it on after that. So we'll start out with security policies. So out of the box, there are really 4 policy types. You can have as many of these as you want, and these are assigned at a group level for machines. So you may have different policies for different machines depending on what kind of functionality you want and the kind of behavior that you want to have on the endpoints. The first one is device control. This is all about limiting or notifying of USB device type usage. So I'll give you an example. We'll say mass storage device. That would be like a flash drive or a USB hard drive. You can elect to block them, or you can elect to log when they're plugged in. In either case, you'll get event notifications for when those types of devices are plugged in. If you do elect to block, you can create exceptions based on a hardware ID. So you could say one flash drive will work, whereas others will not. Now, this is not required in order to protect against USB-based threats. If we see a behavior that we don't like, we will stop it no matter where it comes from. So that could be from the internet, from a USB device, or from CD-ROM even. Now, this is really just a measure of control that we give you over the endpoints themselves, which can help you reduce your attack surface or maintain certain types of compliance like PCI or HIPAA. So I'll leave it pretty short and sweet on that one. Now, really, the first level of protection is this execution prevention. And as the name suggests, we're trying to catch things pre-execution here before they even have a chance of executing. Our goal is to catch as much as possible as early as possible. Now, when I click into this, overall it's a pretty short policy, but it's really effective. And the way that I like to kind of illustrate this level of protection is by reading off when a malicious file is detected. So I'll go down below and I'll kind of highlight it and read off what that says. It says, the file was identified as malicious by our machine learning engine or by other means based on analysis of the file. So in terms of analysis, it's an on-access analysis, meaning that whenever a file or rather a process or a service accesses a file, we trigger analysis of that file. Now, in terms of what that analysis is, it's based on our machine learning engine. So our machine learning engine is built into our endpoint agent, and it's completely autonomous, meaning that even if that machine's not connected to our server or the internet, it's still going to do its job of protection. Now, in terms of what it's doing, we've actually trained that machine learning engine with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of samples of malware so that it can inherently spot malware based on its characteristics via that analysis. In terms of, machine learning, it learns based on observing behaviors and different types of, essentially looking at the structure of malware. So we actually stand not only a high chance of catching, known malware, but unknown malware as well. And the reason for that is because most malware shares similar characteristics, whether it's internals or how it's compiled or the fact that it goes after, specific sensitive areas of the operating system. So that machine learning looks at these things before they even have a chance of executing. And if it looks like malware, we actually kill it or stop it before it even has a chance of executing. And that's essentially how that first layer of protection works. We analyze a file, and then we, if we determine that it's malware, we actually stop it before it can even execute. So I'll leave it at that for the execution prevention. When I get to my samples, the first sample or two that I run, I'll actually catch with the machine learning. Now, if something's able to make it into execution, that's where exfil prevention and ransomware prevention come into play. So these work a little bit differently. The way that these work is we're doing what we call kernel tracing or code tracing. So we run it at a kernel level within the operating system, which is sort of like saying we run it in between the hardware and the operating system. Everything that takes place on a machine goes to the kernel. So if a process tries to read or write to disk, that goes to the kernel. If Chrome sends a packet through the NIC card, that goes to the kernel. So we're actually looking at all those kernel calls in real time to try and ascertain if something is malicious, suspicious, or benign. If it's malicious or suspicious, it gets outright dropped. Its commands actually never make it through the kernel, and we kill that process. And that's essentially how we do protection in this layer. Now, you'll notice these policies are a good bit bigger because we're actually looking at individual behaviors here. And this is essentially a list of all the different types of behaviors. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Dynamic code is a pretty good example. There's a lot of names for dynamic code, floating code, arbitrary code, randomly generated code. What we typically refer to dynamic code exploits as would be fileless malware. There's a lot of different languages that are used for fileless malware. PowerShell is probably the most common, and that's because it's natively available in every version of Windows since 7. So it just allows an attacker to bring a string of code in order to infect someone, as opposed to a tool or a binary that's more easily identified. And one of the reasons that it's harder to identify fileless malware is because you cannot attribute a signature to it. So that's one of the reasons that it has been adopted a lot more in recent years by attackers, is because signature-based solutions really just don't necessarily catch it. Now, it could be any number of languages. It could be Ruby, Python, Perl, Visual Basic, even regular old command line. We don't necessarily care what language it is because we're looking at the actual kernel output of it. We're looking at what it's trying to push through at a kernel level. We also don't care if it's obfuscated. A lot of times with attackers, what they'll try and do is they'll try and essentially hide what they're doing by, wrapping some base64 code encoding around it, or by, adding a bunch of characters that don't break the line but make it harder to read. Again, we don't necessarily care about that because we're looking at the actual kernel level output of that, which we find to be a more effective way of doing protection for those types of variants. Now, there's a lot of things I could talk about in here. I mean, just in general, you'll see injected process, invalid pointer, kernel injections, network scanning attempt detected. Actually, one of my samples will try and conduct process hollowing. So I'll put a pin in that one, and we'll actually talk about that when we get to my samples. So let's talk about the last policy. Sorry about that. The last policy is ransomware prevention. And the reason we created this policy is because ransomware is inherently different than other types of malware. It has different characteristics, different techniques, and ultimately different goals. So we created a policy to reflect that. And you'll notice when I click into it, there's actually a little bit of overlap. Dynamic code exists in both. And the reason for that is that the dynamic code for ransomware is going to look, act, and feel differently. It may be doing things like indexing the drive, looking for ideal candidates to ransom, or it may be doing the encryption itself. So that's why it exists in both. There are specific things in here as well, though. You'll notice the file encryptor, suspicious file modification. So this is looking for file encryption actions, but that's not all it's looking for. It's actually looking for any kind of anomalous file activity. That could be deletes, renames, modifies, interaction with the shadow copies or the VSS service. It's a number of things it'll look for. And I'll give you an example. Say that there's a normal Windows system process that typically does not delete files. And then one day out of the blue, it starts trying to delete files. That could be an indication that it's been hijacked, which is because of its deviation from the norm. So in a case like that, we would typically stop it, and alert you to that behavior and say, hey, do you want to allow this behavior to happen in your environment? And then you can choose to allow it, or you could choose to deny it. So I think I'll leave it at that for the policies. Now, when something triggers on one of these policies, we have playbooks to determine exactly what happens. So you can have as many of these playbooks as you want, and they're also assigned at a group of machines level. So you can have different playbooks for different types of machines or different groups of users. And this is essentially how you set up your automation. So when I click into it, you'll notice in my case, I have terminate process and I have clean persistent data. I don't actually have delete file turned on because I use my samples more than once. It'd be a pretty short demo if all of my malware disappeared the moment I open the folder. So realistically, the way that most of our customers use this is like so, terminate, delete, and clean from malicious all the way to inconclusive. It gives you a very, very secure security posture. You don't have to take machines out of rotation. Users don't have any downtime. You don't have to reimage machines, so it just allows you to, really rectify the issue automatically in real time, which will save quite a lot of work from an IT administrator or a security engineer perspective. It just allows you to automate the full depth of it. So I think what we'll do is we'll get into the event viewer, and let me make sure I'm filtered to my machine, and I'll run a few different samples for you here real quick. All right, so we're going to swap over to my VM, and I've got a samples folder here with a bunch of nasty stuff in it. I like to show this WannaCry because it's ransomware, but it has some Trojan and malware-like behavior as well, so it kind of hits on all fronts. That, and it's just a pretty nasty sample in general. So these are not executable yet. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename them and give them an extension so we can play around with them. And like I mentioned, it's an on-access analysis. So just opening the folder is typically enough to trigger, but 100% a rename will do it because I'm actually reading that file. If I go back to my console and I refresh, you'll actually see an event for each one of these. So there's 2.exe, and it's a malicious file detected by our machine learning. And there's 1.exe, which is also a malicious file. Now, there's a way I like to kind of, go through and show you that it's machine learning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the forensics real quick, and I want to show you the signature of this binary. It starts with 6ED and it ends with D99. And if I click on these three little dots right here, I can actually look this up on VirusTotal, which is a community-driven platform that shows how all the AV vendors determine if something is malicious or not. So 63 out of 69 determined that this is actually a malicious binary. So there is a consensus that this is malware, and it's a well-known variant of malware. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to go back to my VM and I'm going to change the signature of this 1.exe, which is pretty easy to do. I do it with a single command, and there's actually malware out there that can do this automatically. There's a particular variant that comes to mind called Imitet, which is a polymorphic banking Trojan in botnet that will change its signature, change its characteristics, even change its techniques. So pretty scary stuff. I would rather run mine in a little more of a controlled environment. So the way that I change that signature is I just echo some junk into the bottom of that 1.exe, which I'll do right now. And that actually changes the signature. So now it has a brand new signature. It's never been seen. And if I just try and run this, you'll notice that it gets access denied and it gets stopped from running even before it gets into execution. Now, if you go back to my console, you'll notice that it says one raw data item under this event. If I refresh it real quick, it'll actually say 2 raw data items. So that's essentially letting you know there's been 2 iterations of this behavior. And we want to add all of that data to the same event so that you have all that context in the same place. Now, if we go and look at the forensics this time, you'll actually see that signature has changed. It's no longer starting with 6ED or ending with D99. And if I click on the 3 dots and go to VirusTotal, it doesn't actually find anything because that's net new. It's a brand new signature. It's never been seen in the wild. So it can be that easy to get around signature-based tools, which is why, behavioral detections have become much more prominent in the last few years. It's a much more effective way of catching different types of malware, especially when you consider, polymorphic, malware that can change its own characteristics on the fly. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to go into the security policies, and I'm actually going to disable the machine learning layer. I'm just going to set it to simulation mode. And I'm going to run that same sample, and we're actually going to trigger upon the exfiltration prevention and the ransomware prevention policies. We're actually going to stop it based on the behaviors that it's exhibiting. So let me just jump back to my event viewer, and I'm going to go over to my VM, and I'll just close this window out. And I'm going to use this 1.exe again, and you'll notice this thing is only 153 kilobytes, which does not make it any less dangerous. If anything, it probably makes it more dangerous because it's quick to download, or you could easily embed it into something without drastically changing the footprint of the application you're embedding it into. So I'll just go ahead and double click on it, and it'll run and get blocked. So I want to show you the difference here though. Since we're catching this based on its behavior, there's a little more going on in the background. You'll notice under 1.exe, there's a few different events here. And you can actually see the triggered behaviors over here on the right side. So the reason there's multiple entries here is because the first thing that 1.exe does as soon as it executes is that it creates multiple copies of itself, which in and of itself is not inherently a malicious trait. Processes create copies of themselves constantly. What is actually malicious is what each one of those processes tries to go and do. So you'll see over here under the trigger rules that the first iteration tries to do some suspicious file modifications. It tries to do some process hollowing, and it's an unmapped executable. And it's hitting on 2 different policies. The second iteration actually hits on one policy and tries to do all the same things, but in a slightly different way. And then the third one actually tries to do process hollowing and an unmapped executable. So that's the reason I say this is a pretty nasty variant, is that quickly, you guys saw how quickly the pop-up came up. That tries to gain a foothold, build some persistence, and even obfuscate what it's doing, all very, very rapidly, which is one of the reasons that WannaCry is such a nasty variant. So let's talk about process hollowing. In general, if you want to know about any of the behaviors that we're stopping, you can actually click into these, and it will give you a breakdown of exactly what that entails. So process hollowing, as an example, it's essentially when an attacker wants to migrate from a malicious process into a legitimate process to essentially wear it as a disguise. So it's part obfuscation and part persistence. If they move into a legitimate application, they're much less likely to get terminated. And you're much less likely to notice them there if they move into a legitimate application. And it kind of depends on what they're trying to accomplish. If they're trying to spin up a tunnel outside of your environment to connect to a command and control server, they'll probably connect to something or take over something that's more likely to make an external connection, like a web browser. So that's kind of the background there. You can actually see these links below, and you can click on them, and they will take you to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which goes pretty deep. Like this shows you the Windows APIs that are leveraged in order to accomplish process hollowing. Shows you the permissions required, which are user permissions. Even APT groups that don't use it, like Cobalt Strike and Lokibot. There's a bunch of references at the bottom. So not something you'd read for every single event, but if you see something you're unfamiliar with or something you're unsure of, that can be a really good way of building that understanding. So I think I'll leave it at that in terms of my demo, and I will pass it off to the next.
I think some of the things that caught my attention, I really appreciate that, is the integration across your tool sets, how things work together, the breadth of your solution, whether it talks about the OS support or the different deployments. Very full functional tool, yet it seems very simple to use, but full function. The other thing that's really kind of interesting to me is that it works on both remote systems when they're out of the office, in the office, and even when they're offline. So you get the ultimate protection, real time and active. I think one of the other parts of that is you guys tools is not really a first generation EDR tool. You guys have been able to be out there for a while. You've made some ability to not only focus on the functionality, but also function on the usability of the tool. Very impressive. So what I'd like to do is open it up now. If there's anyone who wants to enter any questions into the chat, we'll go ahead and entertain those questions before we end. One of the things that I touched on earlier was VPN. I understand a lot of folks are under the impression that as long as I'm using VPN, I'm safe. I think Justin has shown that there's so much that goes on prior to you attaching to your VPN session that in reality where Fortinet EDR sits, it catches all activity when you boot up long before you have the opportunity to kick up your VPN and create the encrypted connection. So I think this adds another depth and layer to protection that we've not had in the past, and really helps in a lot of ways to address a lot of the really ugly malware and attacks out there. Okay, so I have a question from someone here. Can this tool be managed with a minimal IT staff or without a formal IT department? Absolutely, but it mostly depends on the amount of users you have. The more users, the more possibilities, and the more information you're going to get out of this tool. So that is why we support this as MSP, is because we have the capability to help you monitor those and to help you address those. But if you have a small staff and a small IT organization, absolutely. I think Fortinet will tell you that it is manageable by a small group of people, by 1 or 2 people. Thank you for your time, and we'll close out.